Good morning, this is Michael Hassett, and we're bringing you a new history program called The Past Week. And this is our inaugural show, so we'd like to welcome you all. And my fellow host here is Pat Barry, and I'd like to welcome Pat Barry on
Good
joining.
morning, Michael.
Good morning, Pat. How are you this morning?
I'm very well. We have two Michaels. We have one behind you, and you're talking to me. It's appropriate, isn't it?
Correct, correct. Behind me, you will see the great Michael Collins, the unsung king or leader of Ireland, as many called him, the great what if. What would the Ireland be like post 22 had he had lived? And there's many great what ifs. Or well, if this what did happen, and how his great life was cut short at the age of 32, the 22nd of August, 1922, at 6 minutes to 8 p.m. Where the course of Irish history was changed, and hopefully over the next hour, myself and Pat, who is a Corkman from Michael Collins' home county, we will look at the different antidotes, the different versions of story. They reckon there's 12 different sides to some of these stories, but we will look at some of them today. All we have is the facts that we know, but there is also so many what ifs and unsolved mysteries, because there is still a great mystery around his death. There's still a bit of mystique around his death, which we will look at later. So,
Michael, and indeed, I suppose.
Yes, Pat, go on.
I suppose myself, growing up, I'm older than you, so therefore, when history was taught to me going to school, it stopped at 1916. And of course, these events that we're referring to is what happened afterwards, after 1916. And of course, Michael Collins himself, as we know, was in the GPO in 1916, and he joined hundreds of others in the camps over in Wales, Fongach, after the slaughter of the signatories of the proclamation by the British Empire. And of course, they continued to make huge mistakes wherever they were, and this was one huge mistake they made in executing the signatories of the proclamation. And over in Fongach in Wales, Michael, I suppose, found his position, if you like. They used to conduct an awful lot of their meetings as Gaeilge, so that, people wouldn't be going back with, because there was a lot of spies in that camp, as you know yourself, So for intelligence point of view, that's where he cut his teeth, really, Michael himself, I think, anyway. Some people have different debates about it, but
what Michael Collins really became known for, and what gave him the edge over his fellow comrades in the, we call it the growing Republican movement at the time. It started off as Irish Volunteers, which was a pretty open organisation on the streets. But post 1916, it became, to say, persecuted by the British military, and they rebranded in 1917 and 18. But he really seemed to have focused in and learned from the mistakes, and learned from the mistakes of our previous uprisings, where he said the key to this is intelligence, secrecy, and that also led to he getting involved in the IRB. It was kind of like the circle within the circle, the IRB being the Irish Republican Brotherhood. So you had literally the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. By this stage, the Irish Citizen Army was being moved out. It became more of an all-embracing Republican movement with a very Republican tone to it, rather than aspirations towards military home rule. We now wanted the whole hog. And intelligence was his key.
Exactly,
and
but
if he was renowned for was basically anyone that was suspected of being a spy, take him out. That became his.
And before we come to that aspect,
yeah, go on, Pat. Yeah.
And exactly, but prior, just to go back to how he came about, his dad, his own father, Michael John Collins, of course, was connected with the 1848 movement in Ireland. So he had a huge background, and his own dad, of course, as we know, did not get married till he was 60 years of age. There was a match made from then at 60 years of age. And Michael came along of the youngest of 8 children. Fair play to him, 8 children. And Michael, of course, being the youngest, and he was 76, Michael's dad, when Michael was born, and he passed away shortly before Michael's 7th birthday. And that his dad and his mother never remarried, of course, down there. And they had 90 acres or something like that of a holding down in Woodfield outside Clonakilty. For people who haven't been familiar with it, you can look it up anyway. But Michael was always precocious, was always keen on learning, and an inquisitive mind. And he eventually did the exam for the civil service, for the post office, and he got a job over in London, where he moved in with his oldest sister, living in London at the age of 16, I think it was, 15, 16. And then he immersed himself in all things Gaelic in London. And so he got to know at a very peripheral level. Yeah, he got to know at a peripheral level in the beginning the ins and outs of the civil service, how it functioned at a basic level, So that was all drawn on later on, obviously, as we know. But he met the wonderful, he mixed with Sam Maguire, who we know was from Dunmanway as well, and who gives his name to the All-Ireland Cup today. And he was Sam Maguire, of course, came from Protestant stock, as they say, but that didn't deter his patriotism for the cause, if you like, if you know what I mean. But Michael, of course, as you said, Michael, he was in the GPO, and then, of course, they got an amnesty, the prisoners, and they were left out,
In 1917.
Of Frangok. Was it 1918? They'll have
somewhere 17, but the last came out in 1980. And for a couple of months.
And then there was a lot of agitation decided to go the full hog to get our freedom, really, to establish an independent republic. And so everybody put their shoulder to the wheel, De Valera, Collins, Griffith, the whole lot, full court press, as they say.
Just pause it there now. And we're going to just pause it. There was a very significant event in 1917. The British government brought out conscription. And conscription was to be imposed in England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Now, while there was not much resistance in England, Scotland, Wales, it was resisted very much in Ireland. So there was a big surge towards to support Irish volunteers and Sinn Féin, because Sinn Féin and Irish volunteers were totally against conscription. And there was, in every parish throughout Ireland, there could be up to 200 men marching up and down fields on Sunday morning, joining the volunteers. Because the Irish Volunteers, as I said earlier, was an open organisation from 1913 onwards up to the dawn of 1916 uprising. Basically, 90% of the volunteers decided to follow Redmond, join the British Army, mainly under to go off to fight in World War I under the Tint Division. The Tint and I think it was the 26th was the second one. There was 2 Irish divisions, and the 16th division, one of them being made from the UVF, those volunteer force in Northern Ireland, and Ulster at the time. Northern Ireland didn't exist at the time. And basically, there was a huge surge in support of the volunteers until conscription was going to be imposed on us. But the British government decided that it was literally backfiring them, and they decided not to impose the conscription in Ireland by the end of 1917, which was seen as another Sinn Féin victory. And basically, overnight, I used to hear my local historians in my own parish saying there was one field in my own home parish back home in Maru, County Limerick, and basically it went from 200 down to about 15 overnight. So that hardcore was still there. That hardcore went on to be the nucleus or the basis of what went on to be the IRA from 1919 onwards, whereas the other people who were there marching during the conscription, they just faded away. So they were not willing to go out and fight in the trenches and die for a cause or war they felt was not theirs. So that didn't lead to a major contribution in building the organization, the structure, and particularly the structure on the ground. Call it the cells, the units, the battalions that were later to go on to form the flying columns and all of that. That was a major instance that we don't really factor in, but was led to huge organization skill at the same time. And of course, Michael was renowned for his organizational skills in and getting people to follow him. He had this magic about him that could literally draw people like a magnet to him and get people to do what he wanted them to do.
And you know, Michael, I think a lot of the younger, very, very younger generation, I think the first real exposure they got to Michael Collins's character was captured somewhat in the 1992 film where Liam Neeson played him in the film. I think that captured some of the personality, not all of it, but obviously because it's just one film. It's a shame there hasn't been more in-depth films made about all the other skills he had as a human being as well, you know?
Yes. I do agree.
And
it was a great movie.
And it was, and also, of course, Brendan Gleeson played him in the series that was shown on RTE. Do you remember that? Brendan Gleeson, just 3 or 4 part series.
Yeah, very good. Actually, I think that was the best version of Collins. I think he really did separate the real Michael Collins, like that split personality where he was a politician, a rogue, a local guy, one of your mates, and the next thing he was the most wanted man, as well as being a politician on the national and international stage. He rolled all of these different personalities all into one. I think he really just got it right. Plus, it also helped that he did actually look like him, and he was of the build of him more so than Liam Neeson in the Hollywood blockbuster. And of course,
they were both played him.
It also showed up the very close relationship with Arthur Griffith, because Arthur Griffith was a huge influence on his life.
Yes,
a huge influence. While Arthur Griffith was more activist, he was a politician. They worked well together.
They did. And Arthur, I don't want to say kept him in check, but kept him grounded. That's a better word than anything else. And Arthur Griffith, I think he's much. Yeah, you're right, Michael. I think he's a little bit forgotten in Irish history as well, Arthur Griffith, because a tremendous figure, respected on both sides of the aisle, as they say. Very well regarded, very well respected. So there.
What is very sad about Arthur Griffith, he wrote so much. He wrote so much, and so little of that writing is available to the Irish public today. He was actually a great supporter of what was a huge movement at the time in rural areas of Ireland, and literally has died a death in the last 20, 30 years, is the cooperative movement. Because Collins and Griffith had this idea, post-liberation, post-freedom, of having very much an equal Ireland for everybody, equal opportunities. They were ahead of their time, really decades ahead in their thinking. Rather than having that extreme left-wing Bolshevik view of the state own everything versus the extreme right-wing of the wealthy merchant class, the upper
privatization,
owning everything. They came with a very forward thinking where the people own their own local businesses, their local creameries, their local shops, but they actually own it as shareholders, not this fictional Bolshevik view of the people own it, but really it is the party elite of a political party.
Oh yeah,
You only meant where you could own your own land, but we were working
absolutely.
together. And unfortunately, as we know, post Civil War, and while the remnants of Michael Collins and Arthur Griffiths' party did go in, they did follow that more right wing view of business and politics. Unfortunately, even the founder of the cooperative movement, whose name fails me at the moment, yes, Plunkett, he unfortunately, 8 years after the freedom of the state, 1929, he had to leave the country. Says a lot about the state that followed them.
It does. Well, you see, obviously, with the prior to the Civil War, prior to and the run up to the treaty, then a lot of figures, if you like, emerged around the country in different areas that Collins drew on their expertise, if you like, to agitate for the Irish Republic to have a clean break with Britain. And one of them, of course, an awful lot of. That's why Cork, not because I'm from Cork, but that's how it got its name in one respect. That the rebel county, because there was a lot of very, very good leaders there, and there was seminal events there, of course, with the Kilmichael ambush, as you know, Michael. You know
Mm-hmm.
that was a seminal event in that whole era there. You know, and Tom Barry, who was in the British Army, as you know, in the Middle East, out in Aden, served in the British Army, so he had knowledge of how they operated, how the Brits operated.
Right.
And he used that knowledge and skill to probably have one of the biggest killings in one day, you know, of British auxiliaries and black and tans, as they were known as well. Yes, that's true. That's true. So we are in 2020, and we're running up to the end of the year, of this year rather, a rather uneventful year in many respects because of the situation we found ourselves in.
Okay.
But we're running up to the two seminal events: the murder of Tomás McCurtain in front of his family by the RIC and Black and Tans, the first Lord Mayor of Cork, and then, of course, subsequently, the hunger strike death of Terence McSweeney in Cork as well, the second Lord Mayor of Cork. So Tomás McCurtain has the enviable, I suppose, in my own case, on my mother's side of the family, there's they're related to the McCurtains. That's the McMahoons, the O'Mahanys, and the McCurtains are related on my mother's side of the family. So I have that. I always had that little thing in the back of my head going up. I always knew more about Tomás McCurtain than anybody else, you know, simply because of that connection. But these were heroic figures. These were real heroes, Irishmen. And Michael, couldn't we do with a few today?
You could. And just what came to my mind there while you were talking about him, he coined a very famous phrase that has been quoted by many people down through the years over the last century, but very few people acknowledge who actually said it first. And that phrase was, "It is not he who imposes on you that wins, but he who resists that wins." You have that phrase, Hamja?
Well, yeah, I do. That's. I haven't heard it for a while.
Yes,
but I tell you, it's something that we should, I suppose, bear in mind today. I mean,
but the hunger strike,
bear in mind today, because when they write the history.
Yeah, but the hunger strike was a whole new political weapon that was used during the Irish War of Independence. It was not a weapon or a way of resisting aggression from an outside force used in any other war. The Irish and the Irish War of Independence and Irish Republicans have tapped into this whole new philosophy of hunger strike or starving yourself to death in protest against maybe the conditions that was being imposed on them as prisoners of war, or maybe to make it as a statement in international recognition. It does go back to a very old ancient tradition, going back to our pagan past. I researched the concept of hunger strike many years ago, and I discovered that back in the pagan, Celtic pre-Christian past, if a wrong was done to you by a member of your family or a member of your wider community, you actually went out and you sat in front of their house on a chair for several days with no food or hunger until that person rectified the wrong that was done to you. And this tradition was there in the
Oh,
whole history. And it used to be practiced, but we've got kind of got written out of our recorded history. But obviously, some of these guys were way of that past and way of that.
yeah.
They applied the same philosophy, the same logic to literally, I'm being locked up in a prison for something I believe in strongly. I am not going to take food until I object and I want this situation rectified. And that's where the concept of the hunger strike come from. I only discovered 3.5 years ago. My brother
And
was
of course,
doing research on our own family, and I realized that my grandfather was a hunger striker. And I only found out about a month ago that my granduncle did 46 days of hunger strike in a British prison in 1920. So I'm both a grandnephew and a grandnephew and a grandson of two hunger strikers myself. And it's only after realizing that I began to realize, could I go 46 days without food? I don't think so. And what motivates you to do this? Like, I mean, I know it had a
yeah,
serious effect on both of their health later in life. They were never the same after it. It did really play havoc with the personal health as their lives went on into middle age and later.
of course.
And basically, they were never the same after. But it takes some motivation to actually do that, because our concept of our view of the hunger strike is the famous hunger striker deaths in 1981, the 10 hunger striker deaths that in the H Block prison in Northern Ireland, and that seems to be our only concept of hunger strike. But the hunger strike goes back a century before that. So it has
Oh, it
been,
does.
and there was a huge
It does. And obviously, yeah,
there's a huge hunger strike during the Civil War by the Republican prisoners or the anti-treaty forces. Major serious hunger strikes was used by men and women in that Civil War as well, which is completely, I won't say completely, but very much forgotten by the historians. And please God, when we come to the anniversary in 2 to 3 years' time, that it will be explored fairly and openly without
well,
picking sides in it.
yeah, it'll be given, it should be given yeah, you're right. It should be given a prominent position because, I mean, as you were speaking there about hunger strike, of course, Gandhi operated in that way as well, Mahatma Gandhi,
Yeah,
in the
he was
resistance of the
inspired.
British Empire in
He was
India. So
inspired
he
by
was
the things.
he was in that tradition.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, and now he was taking a more
Yeah.
pacifist role, and he was a pacifist, the ultimate pacifist, you could say. But yes, he used the whipping, if I may call it, the whipping of the hunger strike to embarrass the British authorities in highlighting the injustice that they were doing to the Indian people at the time.
And of course, before not that we should leave it, Terence McSweeney's death on hunger strike, being the Lord Mayor of Cork. I was looking it up there, it was last year, the year before. It made headlines around the world, and that was some astonishing achievement when you consider the majority of people reading those newspapers, not Behold, but they hardly knew where Ireland was because they assumed it was England, do you know what I mean, part of England. So
Yeah.
this act of this heroic act by Terence McSweeney did as much as taking out the G-men, should I say, or anything like that, in highlighting the plight of the Irish throughout the world, which was unbelievable.
Yeah, but
You know,
I
of course,
think
his funeral was astonishing.
you have to factor in one point here. He was just not any ordinary hunger striker. He was a democratic
No,
Lord Mayor. He wasn't a
yeah,
self-imposed Lord Mayor. He was democratically elected through open elections under British rule at the time. And he took a stand, and the next thing, I mean, they believed that he wasn't the hunger striker, the hunger strike that killed him. They believe it was the force feeding that choked him to death. Some say that that is what caused his premature death. And the same, you was really at the very same time in England at the time, you had the suffragette movement that was going on. The women were trying to get their right to vote in England. And a lot of those women went on hunger strike, and a lot of them were being force fed as well. So it was a normal policy, just to be, and to be fair to both sides, to the British, they were not just treating us differently, they were treating all hunger strikers, male, female, British, Irish, suffragette, Republican, they treated them the same. They were not going to stand by idle in their point of view and allow these people to show the whole media of the world at the time. So you've got to factor that side in here as well. And of course, if I may say,
and so
the
struggle continued.
The 1919 election came about. The 1918 election, it was 1919 before they actually, the first Dáil set in January. But the 1918 election, Ireland was the first country in the world to elect a female representative to his parliament, even though the parliament was not yet recognised by the world or the British. We were. So we were progressive in that sense, where we were giving equal rights to female, which was really being.
Well, Michael Collins has many female spies in his group as males. Is many female spies as well. Michael Collins himself, and trusted aides all around him, passing information, etc. So they were forward looking. You're right there, Michael. They were very forward looking, and that was a clean sweep for Sinn Féin in 1990 when they met in the Dáil. I think was Michael appointed Minister for Finance in that Dáil? Yeah, Minister for Finance in 1990. And I don't know, I was very disappointed last year. Yeah, I was very disappointed last year that there wasn't a lot more made of that event, Very, very, very disappointed, that there wasn't a lot more made of the first Dáil in 1919.
That's unfortunately where we are 100 years later. We have a lot of what they call revision history. While it's always good to keep looking and analysing history, we should never try to rewrite it. It is what it is. But we are trying to put different on it for different agendas. You've got to realise that whatever we think of them, they did their best. They were doing the best they could of with limited resources at the time. They were, I suppose, to use a word that's very much used today, progressive and out in their outlook and thinking at the time. We can see later how a lot of that was taken back in the early governments that was formed in what was going to be called the New Free State and that. But there were certain aspects of the celebrations last year, like trying to celebrate and pacify the whole area around the Black and Tans and the RIC, and we were not really focusing on other areas, I think, where we should have more focused on. That does leave and did leave sour taste in the mouth of many people, as we saw, where those.
Well, it was. I thought it was a monumental blunder.
Yes, it was.
On people. Well, Varadkar mightn't know best, but people like Flanagan and them, they should know better than that. They should have been above that kind of carry on, in my opinion. They sullied the names of many, many heroic figures in history, in my opinion, and there was no need for it at all,
Yeah.
But the agitation, it is often said that we bombed and killed our way to the negotiating table. But could anybody in history tell me, was there any other way?
Well, that's a very good point now that you're bringing up, because if we go back to the main players in the War of Independence, I go back even a little bit more, back to 1916. it was out of frustration of 3 home rule bills being rejected. There's a
Yes.
the third and latest home rule bill was passed in 1912 and was be enacted in 1914. And it was being enacted under the summer and was to kick in, I think, around September 1914. And as we know, events in Europe led to the postponement of the Home Rule Bill, mainly World War One. And the summer crisis developed within the British diplomatic service from the onset of May, June, and July. So it was advised to postpone the Home Rule conveniently for the British. Now, I really looked at that situation on the 100th anniversary back in 2014. What if there was no World War One? What would have happened? Probably the likelihood is, if you look at the events that were leading up in 1912 and 1913, the UVF were arming themselves with hundreds of thousands of guns. The Irish Volunteers in 1913 followed suit later with bringing in the guns in through Holt Harbour. Ironically, the Germans are on both sides, which is, if you want conspiracy theories, you could say the Germans were trying to divide Ireland and create a situation in Ireland to distract from Britain. But there would have been
there's nothing wrong with backing 2 horses.
Correct. There would have been a bloody civil war of some sort. So some historians will debate World War One postponed a bloody encounter between the Unionist Protestant British tradition of Ulster versus the nationalist upcoming Republican Catholic supremacy of Southern Ireland. And it would have been very interesting how that would have panned out, because I'm sure if the nationalist southern side was getting the upper hand, I'm sure the British Army would have stepped in. And then in the middle of that, you had the mutiny in the Curragh in 1914, where senior British Army officers mutinied within the British Army at the events at the time. But again, World War One covered up all that very quickly. And it turns out that both opposing armies that was going to fight in the Civil War wound up volunteering and joining the British Army and fought side by side in World War One. And particularly that was very evident in the Battle of the Somme in 1916, where both the 10th and the 26th Division, the 10th Division was mainly, I believe, made up of the UVF, and the 26th made up of the Irish Volunteers. And they fought side by side and died side by side. And there's some great stories coming out, which I won't get into now. It's another story of where they literally fought side by side and rescued one another that night, including Redmond's brother, who was killed. And apparently UVF, former UVF Protestant soldiers from Northern Ireland went out and rescued his body during the night and dragged it in. So, you know, it is.
There you go. I mean, there's been many. You're right, Michael. There's been many heroic stories of that horrific war. It's referred to as the Great War. There was very little great about it, in my opinion. You know, I don't know why it's referred to as the Great War in 1914, 1918. It was nothing but absolutely slaughter of mainly working class young lads by an empire. Anyway, by empires rather, I should say. Anyway, so Michael and the boys and all of them agitated, and eventually, of course, the British thought they could put down these little skirmishes as usual, you know. The Irish would eventually turn and run away and forget about all of this. But of course, I think the event of 1920 on that famous Sunday morning, when Michael Collins' squad took out nearly all of the G-men in Dublin Castle, you know, took them out, absolutely sent shockwaves. I know they went into Croke Park after dinner on the same day the troops went into Croke Park. and fired shots and shot a few people, you know, horrifically, just shot them down, which is no surprise when you look at history again of the British Empire, and being involved in many massacres in many countries throughout the world down through the years. However, this event eventually led to treaty negotiations, as you know.
I just want to
And
make one point that you on about that massacre where they drove into Croke Park with a trusty tinder and opened fire on the crowd. I mean, many people today claimed 13 people got killed, but dozens were injured with sprayed bullets. It could have been hundreds. And I think he's around in nearly the very same time. In India, a similar massacre happened, the famous Amaniska massacre in northern India, commissioned by the British Army as well, in very similar circumstances, where they went into a stadium and machine gunned the crowd and killed hundreds of people by
God only knows how many.
what was his name? Was it Dwyer? Dyer, D-Y-E-R, Dyer, I think was his name, General Dyer. And it obviously shows this was an accepted thing to do within the higher ranks of the British Army, where it was quite okay to massacre the civilian population to keep them in check. You've got to also realize there's another backdrop going on here, and it's something I've been researching personally for the last year. Post World War One, bear in mind now that the war came to an end in 1918, but at the same time, behind the scenes, you have the Treaty of Versailles is going on, while the new war of independence is developing here in Ireland. And you had about 12 to 13 wars going on in Europe, totally unknown. You had uprisings in Germany, uprisings in Hungary, uprisings in Upper Silesia, modern day Poland. In Poland, the Czech Republic was being born. The Czechs and the Poles went fighting. The Czechs and the Romanians went fighting. The Hungarians and the Romanians went fighting. The Romanians were having a kind of coup d'etat civil war. The Hungarians were tearing themselves apart between left, right, and royalists. There's all these wars going on, not to mention the large-scale slaughter that was going on at the very same time in the so-called Russian Civil War, which wasn't a civil war. It was several wars within one.
That's right.
And there was all these pogroms against the Jews, against the civilians. Why it may sound completely a world away from our acceptance of how military should fight today, it was common, it was standard, it was ordinary, run-of-the-mill, everyday life in certain parts of Europe, where the civilian population was just mowed down with machine guns. We forget that today. We're thinking with today's perspective. Back in the day, it was a different, and they looked upon any people that was standing up to them. There was a view that there was somebody behind them. They may have been Reds, they may have been Bolsheviks, they may have been leftists, extreme rights. All these crazy ideas going ahead. But how dare someone rise up and question the authority within the state? And in this case, it was the British authority, and they had been so used to for hundreds of years. Any uprising that was here, it was a case of send out a show of force, put it down, and we melt away. However, guerrilla warfare under Michael Collins changed all that. There's a whole new style of warfare, a style of warfare they had not been.
It did.
And didn't know how to react to.
No.
While the casualty rate was low.
No, they did not.
It set their morale to actually fight. They were not able to deal with it, and the only way they could deal with it was lash out at the civilian population, in their view, that protected these people that were attacking them from behind the ditch or behind the wall or behind the cover of darkness that they used to fight. There was a psychological force as well.
Eventually, anyway, it was out in it was out in the ether then. It was world news then. You see, it was out in the open, if so to speak. The struggle here in this country, the small island of ours, because an awful lot of very good people went to America and built up some fantastic contacts. But then, of course, they had to go and negotiate the treaty, and Griffith and Collins, as we know, they all went over to negotiate the treaty, and that was the first time I think an awful lot of people in the British establishment actually physically saw Collins, or even knew what he looked like
But I think this is a very important.
over at the treaty negotiations.
Yeah, I think this is a very, very, very important turning point in Michael Collins's life or career, whichever way you want to put it. So career would be more apt. Up to here and up to this point, one of his strengths, and one of the strengths that Michael Collins had over the British, over his opponents, was the fact they didn't know what he looked like. He was this mystique, this enigma, this
That's right.
mysterious figure. I mean, we don't realize today that a lot of the press in the UK at the time demonized him. But there was also an equal amount of people putting him up like a Dick Turpin type of guy, a good guy, in this enigmatic mystique about him. He was here, he was there, he was nowhere, and nobody could get one single clear picture of what the guy looked like. They went down, they burnt his house, they burnt his home, they put his mother and his family out of the house, they did everything to taunt him. They literally destroyed his whole home, his family and everything, and yet they could not get him. They had a massive price on his head. Nobody took the bait. And all of a sudden, we have a truce. Now the guys have to come out from under the cover.
Yes.
And Collins did not want to come out from under the cover. He wanted to use this as one of his strengths, stay behind, because
bargaining chips.
As a bargaining chip, what if the talks don't work? We have to go back fighting again, and the next time they'll know him. However, De Valera had a complete different view. De Valera went over first, as we know, on his own. He tried to negotiate with Lyle George. He actually realized that he was not going to get the ultimate 32 county republic, and came back and decided to send over Michael Collins and the delegation that went over, including Arthur Griffith. And there was a fierce row between Collins and De Valera about this. With De Valera being the president, he had to obey the orders, and reluctantly, very reluctantly, Collins said only out of obedience really did he go, but Collins knew then once he came out into the open, there was no plan B. We could not go back to the plan B of hiding behind the mystique. And the amazing thing was, when he arrived for the talks, the first morning when he arrived for the talks, he and the delegation expected this massive crowd outside the building that they met in Britain, which I thought was actually, in hindsight, was not a good idea to negotiate a treaty with the British on British soil. It should have been done on a third party, somewhere like France, or even
the other way around.
Yes, or do it in Dilaman, or do it even in Versailles, because Versailles was just finished at the time. It should have been done there. I think it was a very putting the Irish on the back foot, but that's just personal observation. However, when they arrived there, there was huge media attention around these guys, and there was hundreds of British people cheering Michael Collins. It was absolutely not the welcome that they expected. And even the authorities behind the doors that they were meeting were actually a bit shocked and appalled, if I may so, at the reception that the Irish delegation got. It was just one of those amazing things around Michael Collins that even his enemy.
It was very Well, as we know, I mean, there was a huge admiration within society in Britain at the time, in certain parts, for Michael Collins and the people behind him, because, I mean, on a human level, of course, they recognised this ideal, this struggle for self-determination was a very well and respected principle at the time. And of course, as we know about Lady Lavery, I think took shine to Michael. Some say that she fell in love with Michael We don't know that. We'll never know that. Some say that Michael fell in love with her. I don't know. I don't know. It's only all speculation. But nevertheless, I think I suppose, the standing of Michael Collins went up in an awful lot of people's estimation. But obviously, as you said, Michael, he was out in the open now, so he was a marked man, and they went back then to the Dáil with the treaty. Do you know that yourself?
There was
They
many
went back to the
entities.
Dáil
It
to
was
Dáil here and
rather than
with
just going to that. There was a number of issues here. The Republican leadership in the last 6 to 12 months of the campaign before the truce, a lot of things had happened. There was a number of victories on the Irish side, but we keep forgetting there was one major victory by the British over the Irish, and that was a major showdown in Ashdown, where they lost 81 volunteers. They literally lost near the whole Dublin Brigade of active men. And it was as a result of David Leo coming back from America. He had been away for 18 months. He lost touch with the way events had been happening in Ireland. Of course, as we know, he had Harry Boland with him. Harry Boland and Michael Collins were literally like two twins. They were very close, but Collins and himself grew apart due to that. And he more went over to the De Valera way of thinking and how to deal with this. And De Valera then got airs and graces about himself when he was in America. He was not welcomed by the Irish American Clan na Gael, which was and the IRB within America. He was actually very much ostracized by these guys. And De Valera became very much aware that there is a kind of circle within a circle, as I explained earlier. There is the DIM and there's the IRB and there is the Irish Volunteers, and then there is the Dáil, which is the elected representatives of the country, so as to speak. And there was all these motions going on. So you had Harry Boland, you had and a few more guys who, no matter what Collins would have done, no matter what Collins would have agreed or brought home, they were not going to agree. And you had Cathal Brewer and you had Austin Stack. They were his two major thorn in the sides, and they were determined to bring him down at any cost. So when when Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith and the other 7 negotiated the treaty, you've got to realise that Collins had began a campaign literally before the truce of letting the British access a load of arms dumps. And the whole idea of he letting the British lead themselves to massive IRA arms dumps was to give this illusion the Irish Republican movement was highly stocked and were in for a long haul. Now, it was a complete bluff because Collins admitted later in his diary they had only about 12 days bullets left. So this truce came at a vital time for both sides, without both sides realizing to the extent of what the other was thinking. So it was a complete game of bluff here. And it was a welcome with the Irish Republican movement at the time, and Collins availed of it. Now he's sitting down at the table. Now he's negotiating with his protractors, the guys who had only weeks before had a price on his head. And Collins' attitude was, get what we can, build on it, step by step. But then he had other belief then that it's all or nothing. And it was obvious there was going to be a split, but what way would the split? Collins always reckoned he could bring 80%, 80%.
Yeah, but before.
And basically, he did bring 80% of armed men at the time. However, once the truce came about, there's two very important factors you must realize what's happening during the truce here. The truce now, there's a kind of feeling the fight is over. We may not be going back fighting again. On the day of the truce, there was nothing more than 3,000 active servicemen throughout the 32 counties on the IRA side. However, on the day of the treaty, they had 70,000. So 67,000 people out there felt it was now safe to come out, show their faces, and join up. But yet they were not there when the chips were down and when they were hunted, and their homes burned, and their families being harassed and everything. And a lot of those new 67,000 recruits were the side that went anti-treaty, whereas a lot of the ones that were kind of very active, and of course a lot went both ways, but the majority of them went pro-treaty because they had enough of it. They realised they could get what they could get. However, there's the whole question of the two main issues in the truce. Everyone thinks it's Northern Ireland when it's not. It was actually the oath of allegiance was the main sticking point in the truce. And the irony is, and we mentioned earlier about the home rule. What was the difference? And I remember going to a very renowned historian down in North Tipperary a few years ago. There was a discussion about what was the difference between the treaty and the home rule. Home rule was to be agreed in 1912. Here we are 9 years later, sitting down with the treaty after an armed conflict. And the only difference between the home rule and the treaty was we would have our own independent police force and our own independent armed force, and we could collect our taxes. That's how we gained. We still had to agree, as was agreed in the home rule, 6 counties would work as an independent entity within the island of Ireland under British administration. However, the British did do a very dirty trick where the previous year they brought in the Government of Ireland Act of 1920, which established the legal existence from a British point of view of Northern Ireland as a separate entity. So obviously, if you look at that from another point of view, you can realize that they realized even in 1920, they were going to have to sit down with these guys and negotiate at a table. So obviously, the fact they had that set in the British Parliament kind of sets a precedent to the treaty, which is a very interesting point that most historians don't realize. And not defending it, I'm just stating what it is.
And I contend, I contend that Collins himself, personally, that he knew early on in the negotiations, or certainly before they were well concluded, that what was an offer is all they're going to get now for the time being from the British Empire. But being a pragmatist, he said, we'll go back to Dáil Éireann, to the legitimate Dáil, we'll get this ratified, and we can take care of the North in our own time then when the dust is settled. I think that was his pragmatic thinking, because I think they didn't want any more Irish killing Irish, you know, or anything like that. So therefore, when the tragedy to me is this. Huh?
Yes,
the tragedy to me is this. If De Valera was a true statesman and had the Irish cause at heart, truly had it at heart, the Dáil would have ratified that treaty as it did. They walked out of the Dáil. They would not accept the vote of Dáil Éireann. And he said, we'll put it to the people. They had, as you know, a plebiscite, a referendum to the people, and they in turn endorsed the treaty. Yes, the duplicitous nature of De Valera was, I think he's intent. I don't know, many historians don't look at this, and I'm not a historian of any description. I'm an interested participant in our history, is that I think the ultimate goal of De Valera was to get rid of Collins.
Yeah.
I always believed that.
If you look at the vote in the Dáil, when they came home from London, they had to ratify the treaty. There was serious, very hot debates. Apparently there was a few punch-ups, but very hotly debated, and it went to a vote, and Collins and the pro-treaty side won by a majority of 7, 64 for, 57 against. Then De Valera thought he could get around that and call for a referendum, and the referendum was at a rate of 4-1. Over 80% of the people who voted for the treaty. Is that not an endorsement of the people? Then he came up with that famous speech in March where he would wade through crowds of Irish blood until he would get his so-called Irish Republic.
Yes.
Many years later,
The
he
famous Rivers of Blood speech, yeah.
Yeah, and all these, what you call the speeches of incitement to hatred and all of that, psyched up guys when guys didn't. But I wanted to make one very, very important point here. Many people ask the question, about the different armed groups. Now, we're in the year, right? We're in our discussion here. We're now in early 1922. We're post-treaty, post-referendum, but pre-Civil War. You got to look at the armed groups that was in Ireland at the time. You still had the British Army in their barracks all over Ireland. You had the IRA who had now come out and taken over some of these barracks, and now the IRA was splitting between pro-treaty and anti-treaty. The pro-treaty were now calling themselves
Yes.
Army, while the other guys had various names of hold on to the IRA name, irregulars, anti-treaty, and other such names. But you had the biggest armed group of all, which is never mentioned, and that is basically the non-participants, the side of the IRA who never fought, the neutral guys, and apparently the biggest amount of people within the IRA were guys who stayed neutral. And famous commanders like Tom Barry, I believe, was one of these commanders that did want to, as the kind was later phrase, brother against brother, father against son, and uncle against nephew, and all of that. They did want to fight. And unfortunately,
Dan Breen.
a lot of the recruits in both sides of the Civil War were made up of men who never fought in the War of Independence. That is one of the tragedies of the Civil War, where the real men who did all the work, who got us to where we are, got us not fully, but nearly there, just did not turn on the...
And Michael, believe it or not, on a pragmatic note, we've run well over the hour, so there's only one thing to say, and that is we'll have to do a part 2 on this very soon. So we'll stop it appropriately at the Rivers of Blood speech. Would that be okay?
What we can do is we can do part 2 on the Civil War. Because
exactly. So that and it's important to state, guys, that Michael Hassett is, you would call him a local historian and many other things as well, but we're delighted to have Michael on board on LiRmedia.tv. And as I said, Michael will be hosting this regular program on LiRmedia.tv. But for this edition, I think we'll conclude it, Michael, and it was fantastic insight. And I'm looking forward to the second part anyway. So from this edition of this program with Michael Hassett as your host, goodbye and good luck.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you all. Take care. Thank you.